And welcome to the Empire Room and the Empire Series. This is a new thing, if this is your first Empire Series talk, that the Midwest Political Science Association is trying to make the conference interesting and valuable to you, a venue where you can spend time with a speaker, think about bigger ideas, and see a great and accessible presentation. So I'm the president of APSA. I'm thrilled to be here with you, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker, Professor Lawrence Jacobs. Professor Jacobs is the Walter F. and Joan Mondale Chair for Political Studies at the Hubert H. Humphrey School. He's also the director of their Center for the Study of Politics and Governance, and that's at the University of Minnesota. His center is a preeminent hub for political and policy analysis in the Midwest. Professor Jacobs has published 14 books and edited volumes, and dozens of articles on topics like elections, legislative and presidential politics, elections and public opinion, and on a range of public policies, including healthcare reform. One of the books that you might know is Politicians Don't Pander, Political Manipulation, and the Loss of Democratic Responsiveness with Robert Shapiro. He notes that many Americans complain about the economy, health reform, and U.S. foreign policy, and yet each has dramatically improved. In today's talk, Policy Fundamentals, Performance, and Communications, Professor Jacobs will explore how government performance matters to voters in an age of partisan sorting and elite strategies to bias perceptions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lawrence Jacobs.
It's great to be here, and I look forward to talking to you about the big three: sex, war, and health. I want to blend together what I see as related but unfortunately siloed bodies of research that affect some of the core policy challenges and problems that we talk about all the time. And by we, I mean concerned citizens, researchers, and of course our students and the general public. One of the big questions we face, and there's a lot of debate about, both in the general public, the press, and among scholars, is what drives the public's evaluations of politicians. And there are a lot of different views. You turn on the Sunday morning talk shows and you hear a whole set of perspectives that are really down to the personality of who the president is and who the candidate is and how they're doing. But political scientists have been at this question for a very long time. And I want to kind of dig in on some of those topics and suggest some different ways that they might be thought about. If you go back to Ronald Reagan, but also much before Ronald Reagan, and if you go back even further to kind of the annals of learned politics from practitioners, there's a kind of common perspective, which is that performance regarding the fundamentals, how the economy's doing, peace abroad, and those sort of things, drives evaluations of politicians and the incumbent party and those who run under the party's label. The core idea here is that objective circumstances factor into the evaluations of politicians. Now, in interesting ways, over the last few decades, we've seen this kind of perspective play out in the real world, and we've seen, at the same time, very different perspective emerging among researchers. By the way, this fade, this is called reveal. I just want to run that for you again. This is called reveal. Okay, so here you have Bill Clinton in this kind of tawdry episode back in the late 1990s, and it was extraordinary. He got absolutely pillared by politicians, both parties. The media couldn't find enough awful things to say. Then you throw in an independent prosecutor who dug up the most trashy dirt you could imagine. You couldn't believe it. You were reading it actually in the newspaper or online. And every set of conditions that you might have thought about for a large public revolt against the president occurred, and yet we didn't see that. In fact, the president's approval rating stabilized and remained quite strong. In a famous piece written by John Zoller during this period, he argued, and I think this has now been pretty widely accepted, that it was the performance under the Clinton presidency that buoyed his approval ratings. The economy was absolutely purring along. Unemployment was low at a time when there was economic growth, putting to death the idea of the Phillips curve. We saw budget surplus, unbelievably so. As revenues came pouring in, there were a whole lot of side effects like welfare rolls coming down, in part because of the welfare reform, but also because the economy was purring, some of the lowest crime rates that we had seen in decades, and at the same time we were largely at peace abroad. So that seemed to really reinforce this idea that it's the fundamentals, it's these retrospective judgments about performance that drives things. And then 2000 rolled around. This was an election that was really surprising to many of us who follow elections and have a keen interest in this kind of forecasting of how the fundamentals of the economy would play into evaluations of politicians and candidates. I remember being at the American Political Science Association conference in 2000, and there were 7 folks who were forecasters, these kind of economic fundamentalists. And everybody agreed. Here were 7 political scientists. They all agreed that Gore would win. The debate, and it got quite intense about what variable to include or not to include, was whether Gore would win with 53% or perhaps 59% of the two-party popular vote. Of course, Gore ended up winning the popular vote narrowly and lost the Electoral College vote. But the key point here is that he underperformed by somewhere between 3 and maybe 9 points. And why did that happen? And there's been I think some reasonable research on that traced that underperformance by Gore vis-a-vis what you might have expected given these very positive Clinton record to the fact that Gore literally ran away from Clinton. And so he refused to put a spotlight on the performance issues and really allowed himself to be kind of pushed off message. And this became kind of a demonstration that fundamentals were important, but so was communications. And the ways in which the behavior of politicians, the media's reporting of it, interacted in quite powerful ways. So we've entered a period in which I think there was a kind of growing body of changes in the real world, as well as shifts among scholars and what they were studying and how they were thinking about evaluations of politicians that accelerated this shift to kind of an age of spin. Today, when you think about the Affordable Care Act, at least the folks I talk to, you kind of ask them what they know about it, and it's kind of hazy as to the fact that 7 million folks have actually signed up for the law, 22 million have actually received coverage in some way or another through the law. What they remember is death panel, or the president's famous comment that if you like the plan you have, you can keep it. These are the things that are kind of bantered about, and it reflects this kind of attention to the craft of the kind of crafted talk in this age of spin that we live in. And part of it is the practice of politics, and there's been a transformation in how politics is carried out. When you look at the industry that now exists with thousands of jobs tied up in consultants and in messaging, along with the billions of dollars that flow into it to service the literally million elections every 4-year cycle. That's an extraordinary industry and is creating a lively effort to kind of prime the significance of the spin and campaign strategies to play that up. The media, again, over time, and I would say in an accelerating way, focuses on the drama and on personality. And this is something that our colleagues in communications have been studying for some time. I found it quite interesting, the whole revolt among some of the journalists who follow campaigns against Nate Silver. In fact, I consider it a symptom of exactly this orientation to kind of short-term spin cycle, or focus on personality and on each kind of effort to win that news cycle. Now, at the same time that this is going on, there's an acceleration in an element of our research, particularly in the area of public opinion and political psychology, that is looking at the ways in which individuals process information and the nature of individual cognition in interaction with elite messages and media coverage of those messages. And so things like priming, framing are kind of vibrant areas of research. And they are increasingly connected to some pretty profound effects in our body politic. Things like motivated reasoning, in which we're seeing individuals being kind of triggered to focus on existing attitudes and beliefs, to reinforce biases that start to emerge. And this plays into kind of the siloing of media, with people who have conservative views heading over to Fox TV, those who are liberal finding outlets both in cable but also online. And so there's kind of this constellation, this cycle of a kind of a quick spin in which individuals are getting pulled in and their existing biases reinforced and new ones introduced. Health reform is a great example of that. Now, this has been playing out in a way that's really quite dramatic. I went and I did this is very crude, I'm almost embarrassed that a professional political science convention mentioned this, but just to get a sense of the nature of our kind of scholarly agenda, did a search on JSTOR on a couple terms that really capture these different perspectives about how to evaluate politicians. When you look at the articles in political science on priming and framing, there is more than a 25% increase from this period before the kind of Clinton debacle, before Gore's election loss, 1987 and 1999, to the period after the 2000 election. So we're seeing an increase in kind of scholarly attention to this kind of crafted talk orientation of thinking about political evaluation. At the same time, the kind of economic fundamentalist view that it's retrospective decisions on the track record of the ruling party and their office holders, that has been largely stable and stagnant. So I want to kind of come into this conversation and suggest a couple different ways in which we might rethink our approach to evaluation of politicians, some of which I think are kind of significant. Well, one is we now have a body of research that is suggesting that our focus on spin is probably overstated and needs to be qualified in a number of respects. We've known for some time, and now there's emerging new research, including by my co-author Jamie Druckman, on framing, that shows the importance of elite conflict, of comparable messages, and of media coverage in offsetting some of these frames. That you may well have, the death panel message going out, but there were other messages that were sent out, and while death panel won for some months, there seems to be evidence emerging that it has not won the day. There are also conditional factors that influence when and how these different frames and efforts at priming might matter. So the story about spin and the emphasis that we give on its importance may be a bit overstated. It's not to say that it's not important, but that it may be understated. There's also a persistent body of what I think is pretty persuasive and increasingly persuasive research that performance continues to matter in significant ways. The work by Gabriel Lenz brought in a whole new kind of research method and kind of revived an approach to using panel data to analyze the evaluations of politicians across a number of different areas, and shows that, in fact, performance is quite significant and persistently so across economic and non-economic issues. John Sides and Lynn Vavreck together, and Lynn Vavreck alone, have showed the ways in which performance, along with campaigning, kind of this interaction of the two, has had a pretty significant effect in 2008 and 2012 elections. So I think it's probably a little strong to be the kind of the dominance of this perspective about spin, and in the context of the study of politics, framing and priming, it's probably time for a bit of a correction on that. We can see this in one of the most dramatic ways in recent era, the war in Iraq, and the way in which the public's evaluated that. Here was a case in which performance, media coverage, and elite decision-making all interacted in ways that shaped evaluations. This is a little table I put together, and it shows you the kind of squiggly line is from a Washington Post ABC poll, and it shows you the public's evaluation of whether invading Iraq with with U.S. soldiers was the right decision. That's the line that starts at the top on the far left, or if it was the wrong decision. And you can see that over time, it's basically what you probably imagine, that that Americans have shifted their evaluations. Initially, it was that this was the right call to go in and invade Iraq, and now that is very much a minority perspective, whereas the view that it was the wrong decision from the start has really taken off. Now, why might that be? Well, here are a couple factors. One is when the war started in its early age, you had President Bush and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld playing up the war in ways that elevated expectations among the public, elevated expectations about victory and about the speed that victory would be accomplished. You remember Rumsfeld's comment about shock and awe, and then there were kind of very dramatic reporting from Iraq itself by CNN that the shock and awe has begun, and there was kind of a breathless waiting for the war to be over. Then there was President Bush's kind of premature announcement of mission accomplished. That was just a few months after the invasion. May 2003, President Bush was already announcing victory. Well, soon after that, actually, what we start to see is a pattern of insurgency, of periodic and fairly widespread bombings, a political process in Iraq that was quite dysfunctional, which in turn fed into media coverage of failure and struggles by the Americans and its allies to gain control over the country, and the fatalities and the casualties of Americans and our allies started to really take off. The straight line that you see kind of starting small and rising are U.S. fatalities and casualties, and you can see a pretty close inverse relationship between support and the rising costs of the war as it was seen by Americans. So here's I think a classic example now of a public evaluation where you had elite behavior, particularly the president and his administration, hyping the war, raising expectations. You had realities on the ground, souring, and then you had pretty extensive media coverage of both, and then the growing disappointment. I want to raise another perspective on thinking about how we conduct evaluations, how we think about them. And I want to take it in a couple different ways. We often think of communications in terms of, a president or a candidate. It's focused on the individual's choice of particular words. And I want to suggest that we need to broaden our understanding of communications to institution-based communications that are routinized. Second, we talk about fundamentals, but often we're thinking about it in terms of the economy and not in terms of the establishment of policies that have tremendous real-world effects on the tangible living circumstances of people. This is building on work that I've been doing with Suzanne Mettler related to a new project that we've started. If you think about a lot of the work I described earlier in our analysis of spin and political scientists' analysis of framing and priming, you might think of this as a kind of situational framing. That is, it's focused on a particular context, specific actors who are speaking in a fairly limited time period. So the Affordable Care Act, it's introduced into Congress in the fall of 2009. You have a kind of culmination of the debate, and you start to see this idea of death panels taking off. Well, that's an example of situational framing, particular situation, 2009, 2010. Well, one of the things that's kind of striking about this is that notion of framing. It's very discrete, it's very quick, in a kind of broader way of thinking. It's very time-bound to that situation, and it relies on the volition of an individual over what particular words they're going to use. Death panel. Let's put those together. That'll be quite a harpoon. Now I want to suggest an alternative way of thinking about both communications and fundamentals as it plays into our evaluation of politicians and the work they're doing. And this draws on research that's been done in policy feedback and policy effects by a growing number of scholars. And here, the key concept is that policies, think Social Security, think Medicare, and think increasingly Affordable Care Act, they create a stream of communications. Communications that are institutionalized, they don't come and go with individual, they are systematic, and they become pervasive. Social Security, of course, had statements that it would send out, like a bank report on here are your benefits, here's what you've paid in. Think of Social Security itself and the dramatic job that this institution has done in conveying messages about benefits that are clear, visible, and dramatic, and downplaying costs that are relatively small and relatively invisible to the average individual. These kind of policies not only are communicating in an institutionalized, routinized way, but we're finding through research by people like Andrea Campbell, Suzanne Mettler, Jacob Hacker, and others, growing number of others, that they have a real effect on politics, the ways in which people get engaged in politics. They see a stake and they get engaged. It's very striking if you look back at Social Security. The voting participation by seniors before Social Security was passed was more or less what we found in the general population. Now think about it today. It's one of the common axioms of American politics that seniors participate more. Well, part of what Andrea Campbell shows is that that change is partly because seniors started to see themselves as a political group. They saw themselves as deserving of benefits, and they saw themselves as having a stake that had to be protected in the political process through participation. Now, that's a pretty interesting way to think about politics and thinking about evaluation. If you look at health reform, I think this is an example where we're seeing both situational and structural framing occurring. Certainly in the opening period of health reform in 2009 and 10, we saw quite a bit of this kind of effort on spin, and I think there was clear evidence that these kind of short-term effects, that the potency of a particular set of words like death panels were showing up. And so even though, if you kind of look at the beginning, this is from a Kaiser poll, or actually a trend, some of the best data we have. And it's kind of favorable and unfavorable. Red is unfavorable, blue is favorable. And you can see at the beginning, when the law and the idea of the Affordable Care Act is first introduced, you see a dominance of this kind of favorable view. And over time, that more or less disappears. And it's not surprising. This really fits, I think, quite well, and there's been some emerging research on, in the area of framing, showing the ways in which the Republican opposition, the use of things like this death panel and other constructions, as well as the court challenges, fed into a pretty negative cycle of media coverage that ended up ballooning the opposition. Now, you move into the fall, this is kind of moving further over to the right side, the fall of 2013, when you have the debacle of the initial rollout of the federal exchange and problems in a number of states. And you start to see a bipartisan agreement that the law is not working well, massive coverage by the press of all the problems, and the opposition grows further. In that period, in November, January, February, the unfavorable views are about 16 points higher than the favorable views, and there were even gaps among groups that you might think would be most supportive, including Democrats. Now, here's what's interesting. Over the last year or so, and increasingly over the last few months, as the Affordable Care Act has been implemented and the institutional mechanisms of providing benefits and communicating regularly with people have started to kick in, we've seen a moderation of these negative views, even as that kind of effort at spin by the opposition has continued. And so you can see kind of at the very end there in the Kaiser data, which the survey was done in early March, a kind of narrowing of that difference by about half. There was a more recent poll done just in the last week by the ABC and Washington Post, which showed that the kind of favorable, unfavorable is now at parity. And I think we're probably going to see, my hunch would be, a bit more of that. Now, I'm in the process of a study with Suzanne Mettler using panel data. And so we're going in the field every 2 years. We began in 2010, soon after the law was passed, and then we went out again in 2012, and we're going to be going out again in a few months in 2014, and we're planning on coming back out in 2016. And let me just mention a couple early findings to give you a sense of the structural framing dynamic that I think may be going at play. As individuals have begun to experience the Affordable Care Act in terms of benefits, we've seen a weakening of the perception that the Affordable Care Act would hike taxes. This is one of the main Republican frames, that the Affordable Care Act would just cost you more, you would be paying more taxes for other people to get benefits that are of no value to you. Well, actually, what we're finding in these panel data, and this is obviously preliminary, is that as people see the benefits and they talk about them, that those benefits are having statistically significant effects in moderating that initial anti-tax attitudes, and particularly the view that the Affordable Care Act actually may have no impact or perhaps decrease taxes. Now, as ludicrous as that sounds, actually, when you look at the legislation, it's quite possible. The taxes that are being imposed on individuals are landing, for the most part, are landing on the top 3% of earners. Now, as anti-tax attitudes have moderated, we're seeing this as contributing to increased support for the Affordable Care Act. And so you kind of project that forward as we move into 2014 and the 22 million people and the growing numbers of millions who are going to be covered by the Act, and the communications and the learning that's occurring. Those are forms of messaging that is chronic, it is routinized, and our supposition is that that will continue to have an effect. It is also having an effect in terms of changing the fundamentals of people's living conditions. So I want to close with just a few points, and we can have a lively discussion. First point is, I think, in thinking about fundamentals, that it's obviously the economy is very important in evaluations, but it's probably worth paying more attention or paying attention to the tangible effects of policy on individuals in terms of their living circumstances. The way we think about communications certainly encompasses the situational framing that our colleagues that do work in political psychology are studying, but there may be something broader going on there that's tied to institutions, that tends to be routinized and tends to be something that's much more systematic and pervasive. Now, just to give you a sense of why that might be significant, one of the things that Gabriel Lenz finds in his book is that, and he confirms something that's been known for a while, that issue voting is very difficult. That is, people voting on their attitudes, let's say, to health reform. It's difficult because there's so little accurate information about one's own view about that and where the candidate might stand on that. Well, when you start thinking about an institutionalized process that routinely sends messages to individuals like Social Security and their benefits, where we do find pretty high levels of knowledge, surprisingly high levels of knowledge about how the program works, it may start to decrease the knowledge gaps that we often find as a barrier to issue voting. There's an element of retrospective voting and this kind of performance evaluations that's pretty interesting, which is we often think about voting and politicians that come into office. One of the really important contributions of this view about voters making decisions based on economic fundamentals of the incumbent party and the incumbents is that it provides a feedback, that it's a way for us to hold office holders accountable even if we don't understand all the details of the policy issues. So that's a pretty important feedback. It helps you get someone in office, and if conditions are crummy, well, it's a pretty broad gauge evaluation, but it still is an element, a reliable way in which even individuals who are too busy or distracted or unable to track issues can still make judgments. Well, this is an area where there's actually overlap in this growing area of policy research. And it suggests that we need to be paying more attention, not just to the impact voters have on policy and the direction our government is going, but the reverse, the ways in which our policies can have fairly substantial impacts on both the living conditions of people, but also their core political orientations, whether they're engaged in voting, whether they are collecting information on what's going on, whether they see a stake and a meaning in what their government is doing. Thank you very much. Okay, good, thank you.
All right, we have some time for a question and answer session. I'm going to come out. We're recording this, so if you can say your name before you ask a question, we'll get it online. Is there anyone who'd like to start? All right.
Larry, that was very interesting. I'm Richard Sobel. Could we go back to your slide about public opinion about the Iraq War?
I thought you might want to go ahead.
Okay. Okay. This takes off on something on the last panel and in your panel, which is not only actual success, but perception of success, and the role that political scientists play in the policy process. And this slide, I think, has some really fascinating aspects to it. First of all, the question about right decision and wrong decision has an interesting convergence towards the end of the war. It's almost equal. In fact, the right decision pops up a little bit towards the end. Also, you can see that the cumulative casualties and fatalities really levels off after that steep climb in the last, I guess, year or year and a half of the war. At the same time that the right decision and the wrong decision start coming together. So that's one aspect of this. The other is that there was a political scientist working on the National Security Council who will remain nameless at this point. And one of the things that he was using was political science knowledge that if people think things are going to be successful, they will support policies, even that they might typically oppose, but success, performance, in your terms, actually has an impact. Now, declaring the mission accomplished and declaring the policy successful and having victory is not the same thing as actually having it. But I'm curious about your reflections on the effect of the rhetoric of success and performance, and also how you deal with this fact that the two parts of the whole come together.
Thanks, Rick. That was a great question. I think there's a soft underbelly to the kind of real-world implications of what I'm describing as situational framing. Because if you think of framing as a short-term game, then it's all about winning the 24/7 news cycle. And so President Bush coming out really just a few months after sending in troops, and what we now know to be the beginning of the end of his effort, is an example of that short-term orientation, which is grab that success right away, and that's all people are going to focus on. That it really distills this idea of trying to win the 24/7 news cycle, and that evaluation of these short-term things and the valuations of perceptions are what dominate. That is utterly wrong, particularly in a salient policy issue that people are focused on, in which there's clear information and in which events themselves spin out of control. I think Iraq is a great example of that. The casualties became kind of a Vietnam drumbeat of things not going well. The pictures coming from Fallujah and other kind of famous battles sent a message that was utterly contradictory of the administration's message. Donald Rumsfeld, constantly complained that there wasn't an insurgency, and at some point reporters just started, kind of contrasting Rumsfeld's happy talk with the latest bombings and American casualties in Iraq. And that's obviously the story that dominates. Now, in my view, that's an example of why the general area of kind of retrospective evaluation, focusing on the fundamentals, has so much importance. And it's partly why, whether we're studying elections and it's Nate Silver, or it's those of us who also study foreign policy, it's so important to get out this kind of hardcore reality-based notion that public opinion outside of a short election cycle is longer term. And if you are engaging in a war that's going to be known about and it's going to stay in the news, then you're probably going to be facing some pretty significant backlash. Now, in terms of the fading, the closing of that gap, a lot of what's going on there is being driven by party sorting. You've got different president, and probably what I should have done was just ended it with Bush leaving office, and the trend would have continued.
Next question. Yes.
Larry, Dave McElby, BYU. You've mentioned the 24/7 news cycle and also the examples, death panels, and so forth. I'm wondering to what extent are they related? That is to say, people self-select and start to adopt the issue frame of their chosen media outlet, and to what extent people who don't attend to that media outlet miss the framing, or does it lead out into the broader public?
It's a good question. There's quite a bit of research in that, and I would say the big picture on that is once you have a frame launched and it's into the media cycle, it gets out there. But when you look at consumption of news, particularly among conservatives, it's a fairly airtight maybe it's too strong, but it's a fairly encompassing world on the internet and then Fox News. So, it's quite striking. It's about, last time I checked, I think 42% of Republicans still believe that Saddam Hussein was behind the 9/11 attacks, even though there's so many studies that have now, conclusive studies, U.S. Army, the 9/11 Commission have come out and said he had no effect. In fact, Saddam Hussein was quite hostile to Al-Qaeda. There's no evidence of that. So my point here is I think, and I think the research, particularly when you kind of pull together the research on framing, and then you bring in the motivated reasoning arguments, it's a very persuasive and argument. The friendly amendment that I'm offering is I think these are too short term. That particularly in the set of issues, and I'm not talking about campaigns, because I think in a short campaign, that probably is the right way to think about it. Though, as Lynn Vavreck and John Sides have shown, it's hard to do it because it is so short term and because the media is the nature of its coverage. But I think outside of a campaign setting, for instance, in health reform, that framework has some real limitations. And it's important to think about framing in this broader structural institutional context and the ways in which communications are going on there. The Kaiser Foundation has been doing these news indexes, and it's starting to pick up a kind of a pretty dramatic shift in the balance of positive, negative coverage about the Affordable Care Act. In October, November 2013, it was overwhelmingly negative, and it's much less so in the latest reports.
Next question. I have one, actually. I'm curious about the Affordable Care Act. And so, if it's allowed to persist, then over time it'll cover more people. Do you think, let's say you're thinking about a panel study, 10 years from now, do you think that the Affordable Care Act will be largely intact? And if it is, do you think that a majority of Republicans would oppose it or support it?
Great question. So let me come at that a couple ways. One is already we're seeing Republican behavior changing. So the Affordable Care Act, the two primary dimensions here are the exchanges, and there are only 16 states in the District of Columbia that have adopted it. But the Medicaid part has been adopted by half the states, Arizona and Ohio and Michigan, which all have very conservative governors, have pushed it through. And my reading is somewhere between 8 and maybe a dozen more Republican governors will adopt this within the next year. I was talking recently to one of the senior people at the Republican National Governors Association, and he said, concrete discussions, and the thinking among many of these Republican governors is we get past the primary, we get past the election, and we have to move on it because of the fiscal federalism. It's just too much money. It's 100% coverage for 2 more years, and then it goes to 90%. And then there's an incredible match on administrative operations. So it's literally follow the money on that part. Now, it's interesting, there was a paper done by several people who were showing that when you control for party, that we're finding Republicans who are uninsured beginning to become more supportive of the Affordable Care Act. And that would be kind of the Social Security trajectory. That as people, and this is, I think, what you were suggesting, as people become more aware of and experience the benefits of Social Security, even if they're Republicans, they're going to begin to change their attitudes. Now, this is a case where I think it's endogenous, because you've got Republican policymakers now at the state level. The House voting on repeal is not what's going on at the state level in many states. There are some where that is, but and I think we're already starting to see a change in rhetoric, at least, among some Republicans in Washington. As that changes, then some of the partisan sorting is going to start to weaken, and so you've got this situation where a growing number of Republicans, I believe, in the next few years, are going to experience the Affordable Care Act, and the elites are going to begin to respond to that. So I think that's pretty significant. Just by the way, you may remember in February, the Congressional Budget Office came out with a report, and they got tons of press coverage because of some really inaccurate spin on what the CBO reported, which was CBO said that the number of hours that workers would choose to work would decline because they wouldn't be locked into a job for health care. That got spun into the Affordable Care Act is killing jobs. The CBO explicitly says no. That's what the media covered, but actually the report had all sorts of very interesting information about the Affordable Care Act, including its projection that by 2018, 25 million people would be covered by the insurance exchanges. And its estimate for what just closed at the end of March was 6 million. And at least the number signed up is, of course, above 7 million. So, this is no longer speculation. This is kind of, the train has left the station. And everything we know in the study of policy, and particularly policy effects, leads me to believe that there will be this broadening of support. With one caveat, I think there could be parts of the law that are not visible, that people may not be aware of, or if premiums increase in a dramatic way and people feel that, it could have a negative effect. So there's a lot here that we're going to sort out, and it may be probably will be much more complicated. But the bottom line is the Affordable Care Act is here, and it's starting to have these structural framing effects already.
Okay. All right.
Steve Gottlieb, Albany Law School. And I was curious as to how it might clarify some of what you're saying. To speculate about whether or not the House Republicans imagined or read today's lecture about 2 years ago in structuring their response.
So I think the key thing with House Republicans is to appreciate that congressional districts are overwhelmingly ideologically homogenous. That is, if you're coming, well, let's take Michelle Bachmann's district in Minnesota. Minnesota overall, moderate state, presidential elections, it's voted for Democrat every year since 1972. Okay.
I didn't mean the numbers, I meant
No.
the strategy.
Yeah, no, I think the strategy is driven by the preferences of the caucus and the preferences of the district voters who support the party, and overwhelmingly not only Republican but quite conservative, and that is unlikely, frankly, to change a whole lot. There's two ways in which you might see more responsiveness of the sort you're talking about. One would be conversion. Oh my God, I don't want to lose. I got to kind of moderate my strategy and find a way to appear, at least, to be more thoughtful and willing to compromise. Another is replacement. You kind of vote out the crowd that are unwilling to change. And I think, given how strong the philosophical views are about the Affordable Care Act among House Republicans and the reality of their districts, they are responding to the partisans in their districts, that probably we're going to be looking at a replacement strategy before we see any real change. Unfortunately, then, bottom line, I don't think my lecture would have much impact on them.
Okay. We have time for one more question.
Adam Levine at Cornell. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about how you expect rhetoric on this policy to change over time, especially on the Republican side. So I'm sort of thinking about, on the one hand, last week the Obama administration, this week I guess, the Obama administration could point to a success, but any language of success could easily bring to mind many, many failures to many people who are listening to that, that aren't necessarily related to experiences, as you're talking about. And so I'm sort of curious if you think essentially that, or how you expect sort of the dynamics of the rhetoric to be over time, whether they're going to sort of shift away from early failures towards focusing on experiences, hopefully successful experiences, or something else.
So let me give you a response for two different time periods. I think in the short term, we're going to see time periods aimed at the partisans. And so the president's declaration of success was almost entirely aimed at Democrats. And probably the most important political change that's happened in the last, well, frankly, 2 weeks or so, has been that the Democrats have become much more favorable towards the Affordable Care Act. That a lot of these changes that we're seeing, it's being driven by changes in Democratic opinion. Now, when you think about turnout in the midterm election, this is all about for the most part, will the partisans turn out? And that was a big fear among Democrats. So what Obama was trying to do was really to rally his troops to support it, and I think we'll hear a lot more of that, and I think we'll hear Democrats speaking of their troops. Now move past November, and I think we're already starting to see some difference. You're hearing at the state level Republican governors talking about the law's here to stay, but we're going to find a way to make it fit our state. And there's some pretty significant proposals that Democrats and liberals won't like, but that will implement, particularly the Medicaid expansion. I think the exchange is already evolving in some ways that probably will pick up speed, like private exchanges, e-health. I think we're going to see that kind of growing, and we may see more latitude given by the federal government to allow even brokers and private insurers to get into the mix. That's undecided yet. So I think we're going to see kind of a more of a pragmatic approach to how to get people involved, and it'll be more with the laws in terms of the outcomes. No pre-existing conditions, subsidies have to be provided, but as to who provides those things, there's going to be much greater pragmatism on the Republican side and the Democratic side. The bottom line is the Democrats cannot win in reaching their goal of being much closer to universal coverage for American citizens unless Republicans at the state and national level engage and participate. To do that, they're going to have to pay a policy cost to do it. And they're willing to do it now.
All right, Professor Jacobs, thank you for a wonderful lecture, and to all of you, thank you for the entire series. Again, this is a new thing for the Midwest Political Science Association. If you like this format, if you'd like to see more of it, please let us know. Think of ways we can change it. We'd like to know that as well. And thank you for supporting the organization. Enjoy the rest of your conference.